In Britain, in the United States, in China, in India, you get far more deaths in middle age from tobacco than from alcohol. This is mostly in men. It's the men that smoke, it's the men that drink in these countries mainly. But in Russia, it's different. In Russia, in Russian men, you get far more deaths from alcohol even than from tobacco. And the Russians smoke a lot. And it's even more striking if you go to earlier ages. If you say death before the age of 55, say death between age 15 and 55, what's the chances a man's going to die before he's 55 in Britain? Well, it's only 7%. Most of us don't die before 55. And if we didn't smoke or drink, it'd be 4%. So 7% of British men would die before age 55. But at the 2005 death rates in Russia, it would be 37%. And most of that difference is death from drinking vodka in ways that get you seriously drunk and then keep you on drinking on top of that. What's more, the Russian death rates have fluctuated wildly as vodka intake has fluctuated. When Gorbachev came to power in 1984, the Russian male death rates in middle age were really high. Gorbachev introduced strong anti-alcohol measures when he first became leader of the Communist Party in Russia, and alcohol consumption went down by a quarter, and within a year, deaths in middle-aged men were down by a quarter. Then, after a few years, the communists were losing power, and then in 1991, communist power collapsed, and Yeltsin took over, and all the restrictions on alcohol vanished. There was a huge increase in alcohol consumption. There was, everything else was more expensive. People were completely demoralized. And the Russian death rates more than doubled. If you take the probability of death before you're 55, it went down by a quarter with Gorbachev's alcohol restrictions in 1984-85. And then between 1988 and 1994, it more than doubled. And it shot up to rates far higher than you would see in sub-Saharan Africa. And then as the country stabilized a bit in the mid-90s and it came down again, then there was a new ruble crisis in 1998 and it went up again. And in the early years of the present century, 2000 and 2005, the death rates were so high that you'd have 37% of the Russian men dying before they were 55 at those death rates. We did a study. Other people were claiming that it was alcohol. I couldn't believe it. I'd never seen hazards like this from alcohol. So we did a big study to check the results from their small studies, and we really showed that they were right and we were wrong. And we took 60,000 deaths in 3 typical Russian cities, and we went and found the address at which the dead person had lived, knocked on the door and said, is the family still living here? 50,000 of them were, and if they weren't, nearly all of them collaborated with the interview. And they're very collaborative, the Russians. They were very helpful in research. And they told us what the dead person had been drinking, and we could look at the disease that people had died from, and we could get the story of what they'd been drinking, and we could relate their drinking habits to the disease they'd died from. And if you want to know what a Russian man drinks, then ask his wife after he's dead. He used to drink a bottle of vodka down out. It's not just one a day, though. When he'd get drunk, he'd get through 3 bottles in a single day. Stories like this. But this pattern was seen only among people who died from certain causes. Things like intestine cancer, they're nothing to do with alcohol or tobacco, and they'd got average alcohol consumption rates. So we could use the diseases that shouldn't be anything to do with alcohol almost as controls. It's a very crude method, but because the hazards were so big, we could pick them up easily. And we found that overall, the people who were drinking, say, 3 bottles a week or more, that they'd got twice the risk of dying from disease. They'd got 4 times the risk of dying in traffic accidents. They got 6 times the risk of dying in other accidents. This is in comparison with the people. We couldn't do it in comparison with non-drinkers because there weren't any. You had to do it in comparison with the people who were drinking less than a bottle of vodka a week. And they got 8 times the risk of committing suicide, and they got 10 times the risk of being murdered. And for women, it was even worse. The women who were getting through, 3 or more bottles of alcohol a week, they'd got something like 15 times the risk of committing suicide and 20 times the risk of being murdered because drunken women hang out with horrible men. It was a complete catastrophe. And then you could see the diseases that the conditions, the accidents, and the particular diseases, pancreatitis, liver disease, and so on, that were much more common among the drinkers. And then you could look back at these wild fluctuations in overall mortality and say, well, what were the diseases that caused these fluctuations? Well, it was the diseases that are caused by alcohol. It was the diseases that were more common among the drinkers. The cancer rates weren't varying. And it wasn't a failure of registration, it wasn't a failure of death registration, it wasn't a failure of the medical system. The cancer rates remained pretty steady all the way through, so did the child mortality rates, so did death rates among old people. Well, if it was a failure of care, then the young and the old should have been more vulnerable. But no, that wasn't where the variation was. The variation was not even in ages 5 to 15, it was at ages 15 plus. It was in the young men, in the middle-aged men. That's where the huge variation was, and it was limited to those diseases that could be driven by alcohol. So these extraordinary variations in Russian mortality were caused by alcohol. So alcohol is primarily responsible for the very high levels of Russian mortality in comparison with other industrialized countries, and for the wild fluctuations that have taken place over the last 20, 30 years. And the government is at last trying to restrict extreme alcohol consumption. They've introduced regulations in 2006, further regulations in 2010. Who knows whether they'll succeed? And the Russian president now says that he actually wants to get restrictions on tobacco as well. He says he wants to avoid all these premature deaths from alcohol and tobacco so that Russians have normal life expectancy. Well, if they can get particularly the deaths from drink under control, and also do something about the deaths from tobacco, then yes, they'll do that. There's no reason why in the 2020s, 2030s, Russian death rates shouldn't be much like the death rates of Western Europe. There's nothing intrinsic about the Russians except for the drinking and smoking. It's the pattern of drinking.